who solicited and valiantly brought the Oblique Autobiography into existence. You'll find copies of the book in the bookstore area in front of the gallery. And now let's welcome Pamela M, who will be organizing today's event.
Thank you. This mic is working, yes?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my supreme pleasure to welcome you to FêTE which in some corners is also affectionately known as Gabfest, Gabathon, Gabapalooza, or just plain Party for Yve-Alain. I am Pamela M, and I teach modern and contemporary art history at Yale University. Let me begin by thanking Miguel and Catherine and all the staff of the gallery for so generously hosting today's event. And cheers are also due to the editors of No Place Press, Rachel Cherner, Jordan Cantor, and Jeff Kaplan, who published Yve-Alain's and Oblique Autobiography. Extra special thanks to Jordan, who is not here today, but brought this book into the world as its editor. Finally, deep bows to our fabulous line of speakers and to all of you in attendance, whether in person or, thank you, or virtually. It feels like a family reunion of sorts, a good family. It was not so very long ago that such a gathering would not be possible, and so we can only be very grateful for the moment. Speaking of timing, many of you know that Yve-Alain retired from the Institute for Advanced Study last June, where he was professor in the School of Historical Studies for 17 years. And then there was the recent release of Oblique Autobiography, hot off of the press as of just last week. Between the retirement, the book, in other words, we hardly need to justify a celebration, but there is a longer backstory here that I will briefly narrate. 10 years ago, on Yve-Alain's 60th birthday, a group of his former PhD students collaborated in the making of a pseudo-fest trip with the profoundly inauspicious title, Typing $4. For those unfamiliar with the academic institution, a fest trip is a book dedicated to a respected academic figure, typically a volume of collected essays by their students. Our version followed the genre in its gratitude and affection for Yve-Alain, but otherwise went rogue with the genre's high-minded conventions. Tucked away in its pages were artistic masterpieces, such as this scribbled gem, a collaboration by Amy Soman, Thomas Egger, and Devin Ford. Its main were the collected pseudo-abstracts for pseudo-academic papers or pseudo-academic journals, as in this brilliant send-up by my esteemed colleague David Joselit, entitled Painting as Supermodel. And it might be a little hard to read what it says there, but trust me, I think you probably already understand the joke. But even as we had some fun at Yve-Alain's expense, who knew that Mondrian humor was a thing, we understood that the homage was only a placeholder. For one, Yve-Alain left Harvard all the way back in 2005. And some of his graduate advisors, myself included, are beginning to think of retirement. Meanwhile, since 2016, Yve-Alain has spoken about returning to France for reasons pegged to that less than banner year. And finally, he and Paul are off to Italy for a good spell, very short. So there is no better time than now for this celebration, which I'll call, in poaching the language of his book, an oblique Festschrift. We might pause to think of the word oblique in this context, a strange descriptor for Yve-Alain's contribution. There is, to be sure, nothing indirect or obscure about his thinking. The unerring eye, the cogency of his analytical frameworks, the rigor with materials, the frankness of his judgments, whether something is absolutely brilliant or totally mediocre. These are not qualities we associate with things oblique. Yet I'd like to honor a dimension in Yve-Alain's work that, while not oblique in the sense described above, suggests a sidelong glance or particular angle on his work and mentorship. Bois' scholarship is stereotypically reduced to the M's and P's of modernism: Matisse, Mondrian, Malevich, Picasso, and Pollock. For good measure, we could also include the K's in this alphabet in his writing on Ellsworth Kelly. Still, decades in advance of art history's so-called global turn, Yve-Alain was also teaching us about a Brazilian artist in Paris or a Filipino artist in London. You're all very familiar with these works. It is not the double line, nor the degree zero painting that we see here, but a dialogue of hands, choreographed by the extraordinary Leisure Clark. It's not the archy drawing, nor the snip at play, but the energy issuing from David Medulla's effervescent cloud canyons. We owe Yve-Alain an enormous debt of gratitude for sharing this work with us, for letting us see it through his own deeply felt histories with both artists. I am sure Bois would hate being thought of as, quote, ecumenical in his aesthetic inclinations. The word sounds suspiciously Catholic, after all, but the examples of Clark and Medulla enlarge how we might better appreciate his scholarship and mentoring. Indeed, seeing this art in seminars many years ago empowered students to take a more expansive view of post-war art than previously understood. In Clark and Medulla, we find an art of a conditional and a contingent embodiment of kinesis, materiality, and time. An art, dare I say, of the intimate and relational. They invite us to approach, and hence view, the chronicles of modernism askance as a Mobius strip or a vehicle for energy directed elsewhere. For me personally, Bois' affinity for such work allowed me to grasp the temporal mediations of sculptural form, a kind of time-based art absent cinema and the bland pretensions of so-called interactive art, reworking histories of the object from constructivism to minimalism and beyond. Nowhere was this conceit better confirmed for me than when it came to the dissertation written over a quarter century ago. I recall meeting with Gough to discuss some half-baked ideas I had about sacrifice and destruction in post-war art. and you won't be surprised in my saying this, that I was reading a lot of Bataille at the moment, following Yve-Alain, following Rosenkranz, following Denis Ollier. Yve-Alain patiently indulged my blather until I made a casual aside about an artist I had only just read about, an obscure sculpture best known as a son of a second-generation Chilean surrealist. You should write about Gordon Matta Clark, he explained. He then proceeded to tell me about Matta Clark's conical intersect, a work that cleaved the relationship between eye and body, figure and ground, through its simultaneous destruction and proliferation of architectural perspective. The imperative could not be denied. It is at once too banal, self-aggrandizing, and downright stupid to say, quote, the rest is history, unquote. Indeed, what both Yve-Alain and Matta Clark taught me was precisely the opposite, that history itself, art history in particular, is a seeming transparency we need punch holes through repeatedly, both a formal and ideological contrivance. The insight, however fundamental, is a gift. It is an emblem of Yve-Alain's intellectual generosity and trust in his students that now licenses us to do the many different kinds of work that we do. From writing about radical photographic tourism in the Soviet Union, for example, or AI, or television in the diggers, or the double in modern and contemporary art. This is just one of his many gifts that we celebrate today. So onward, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep the introductions of our esteemed panel very brief. We are going to begin with James Meyer, Yve-Alain's first PhD student at Johns Hopkins, who is now curator of modern and contemporary art at the National Gallery of Art. So welcome, James. We'll then hear from Maria Gough, Joseph Pulitzer Jr. Professor of Modern Art at Harvard. She is followed by David Joselit, who is Arthur Kingsley Porter Professor of Art, Film, and Visual Studies, as well as chair of that department at Harvard University. We'll hear from Christine Mehring, the Mary L. Block Professor of Art History and the College at the University of Chicago. And after Christine is Michelle Kuo, the Marlene Hess Curator of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art. Finally, I will read some brief remarks by Harry Cooper, who is unable to attend, the Senior Curator and Head of Modern Art at the National Gallery of Art, DC. We will then have a group conversation featuring the man himself. So thank you, everyone, for your presence today. Thank you for your good energy. And I will say, to open the thing, allons-y. Musical chairs.
I have no slides, I just have a few remarks. Allow me to express my heartfelt congratulations to Rachel Chandler, Jordan Cantor, and Jeff Kaplan, the editors of No Place Press, on the publication of Yve-Alain of an Oblique Autobiography, carefully edited by Jordan and presented in a clear and companionable format of Jeff's design. The appearance of this volume is a watershed moment and a source of delight for the many fans and admirers of Yve-Alain and his extraordinary work. And Pam Lee, the organizer of this event, is especially to be thanked for bringing us all together on this happy occasion, which coincides with Yve-Alain's retirement from the Institute for Advanced Study, whose chair first held by the likes of Panofsky. How to put into words the significance of this most personal and most surprising of Yve-Alain's publications? Where does an oblique autobiography fit within his estimable corpus? What insights does it reveal about his scholarly practice and his history, the ostensible theme of the autobiographical form? Consider the rather curious title, The adjective oblique is a geometric principle familiar to us all, suggesting a line that is, quote, neither perpendicular nor parallel to a given line or surface, a line that slants and slopes, diverging from a straight course. Yet it's the rhetorical meaning of oblique that hews closer to Yve-Alain's title, implying a thought indirectly stated or expressed, not straightforward. As Yve-Alain notes in his introduction, as he started to organize this, quote, pile of homeless essays, as he describes the volume's contents with endearing modesty, he came to think of the book in the making as a, quote, involuntary autobiography, an autobiography in disguise. Absolutely essential to Yve-Alain's conception of the autobiographical form is a view of the book's protagonist himself, as often a mere witness to the conversations or events he describes, or the seminars he attends, those of Barthes and Damisch, or as a reader of an essay or book whose insights would prove so essential to his future work. The narrator of an oblique autobiography is less interested in the moi than in the toi, the impact of another's texts or works of art in the constitution of the critic's identity. To know Yve-Alain, as many of us do, is to feel one is in the presence of a scholar of unusual self-confidence and direction. The Yve-Alain I met as a student in 1987 was, at 35, already a formidable scholar whose collection of essays, painting his model, would be published to acclaim a few years later. The Yve-Alain we encounter in an oblique autobiography is not yet fully formed. We read of serendipitous encounters with the likes of Jean Clay, Legia Clark, Guy Brett, Rosalind Krauss, and others, as well as purely imaginative relationships, as described in his essay on Robert Klein, whose published work made a lasting impression on Yve-Alain as he debated whether to pursue a promising studio career. The precocious Yve-Alain was offered a gallery show at the ripe age of 17, or, that's 2 years before Smithson, by the way, or whether to embark on the study of art history, a field whose calcification in France during his youth nearly drove him from his future avocation. Autobiography, Benjamin observes, has to do with time, with sequence and what makes up the continuous flow of life. Benjamin is describing the conventional autobiographical form as prevalent in his day as in the current age of confessional podcasts and navel-gazing memoirs. Like Benjamin's fragmentary memoir of his childhood in Berlin, an oblique autobiography is a compendium of recollections arranged in no particular order. Images of Yve-Alain the teenager recur throughout the book. His epiphanic discovery of Klein's writings in a Poe bookstore in 1970 is mentioned on page 109. His citing of photographs of Legia Clark's work and meeting with Clark herself in 1968, when he was 16, appears on 191, some 2/3 through the book. We meet Barthes first in the essay Tough Love, his chapter on Damisch, on 161, and again near the end of his book in his beautiful recollection of Barthes' seminar entitled Writing Artisan Narrator. Yet Yve-Alain's portrait of himself as a young and not so young man is not a dry recitation of scholarly positions and ideas. For Yve-Alain does the reader the great favor of introducing many of these texts and the context of their composition. Written with refreshing candor, these asides are often quite revealing. From Jean Clay, he learns the importance of researching the totality of an artist's production before trying to write about it, and Clay's aversion to psychological analysis, a lesson absorbed before Yve-Alain studied with Barthes, whose book on Racine notoriously omits the playwright's biography. From Clark in her work, he's introduced to a phenomenological model of spectatorship that activates the viewer, and a perception of Mondrian's art as a destructive endeavor, a reading subversive of the purist Mondrian advanced by the influential critic Michelle Kuo, author of the first monograph Yve-Alain ever owned. Klein confirms his heretofore unarticulate suspicion of historicism, the idea that artists exist in a chain unbroken of influence, later exemplified by Greenberg's criticism, and the American scholar Nancy Troy represents a rigorous model of archival practice. These and other figures we encounter in an oblique autobiography supply the young art historian with an arsenal of critical tools and techniques that have proved so essential to his mature work. And where more proprietary scholars, attached to the fiction of their own uniqueness, might hesitate to divulge such secrets, Yve-Alain is not shy about revealing the personalities who affected him most profoundly and their lessons. So confident is the author in his gifts, he gives credit again and again to the role played by others in his formation, an impact we can only imagine was totally reciprocal. For the great theme of Yve-Alain's book, to my thinking, is the practice of scholarship, the life of the scholar. The researcher portrayed in his book is no Casaubon, the solipsistic scholar of Eliot's Middlemarch, indifferent to the thoughts and emotions of others. The scholarly pursuit portrayed in this book is amiable and dialogical. And while the formats of the book's contents vary, ranging from art criticism to book reviews, an encyclopedia entry, and even an unpublished letter to the editor, my favorite chapters are those truly described as autobiographical, especially those that bring us back to the extraordinarily fertile period of Yve-Alain's youth, and that capture an ambience of real intellectual comity and vivacious exchange. Curiously, the most recent of these texts, his memoir of Brett and David Madolla, Angels with Guns, enlists the same narrative techniques and attention to the most minute details of Yve-Alain's finest art historical texts, like Matisse and Arte drawing, and Kahnweiler's Lesson, his study of Picasso, which lead the reader on an archival adventure through the artist's careers, culminating in Matisse's discovery of the color-quantity equation in The Joy of Life, and Picasso's turn to Cubist semiology after his fateful encounter with the Grey Romance, the inspiration of the famous guitar. Angels with Guns is similarly and obsessively archival, an account of his relationship with Brett and Madolla from the early 70s until the recent deaths of these dear friends. The memoir marshals extensive personal correspondence to evoke the events and personalities he recalls so meticulously. The Matisse and Picasso essays I mentioned culminate in eureka moments. The artist makes a unique discovery that transforms his practice. The author's system is revealed. Yet friendship is not defined so conclusively. You can't tie the strings together neatly at the end. The formats of the memoir and our history are not reducible after all. Even after the friend is no longer with us, the friendship continues in memory and in writing. For as I read Angels with Guns, I almost felt as if Guy Brett were looking over Yve-Alain's shoulder as he was typing his text, or my shoulder as I was reading it. So vivid and so detailed is Yve-Alain's portrayal of their long and fruitful dialogue. As we sat in Yve-Alain's office at Johns Hopkins so long ago, the phone rang. Yve-Alain picked up the receiver. An international call. Guy, he exclaimed with clear delight. The name Guy was unfamiliar to me. Reading Angels with Guns so many years later, I could now understand why the faint sound of the English accented voice on the other end of the line could bring Yve-Alain such joy. Congratulations, Yve-Alain, on the publication of this really marvelous book.
Sorry, it wouldn't be an event like this if it weren't technical issues. Just, one moment, please.
begin by thanking the gallery and my dear friend Pam for organizing this celebration. Our extraordinary PhD advisor, Yve-Alain, on the occasion of his retirement and the publication of this incredible book. As we've heard from via James, it's an anthology of new and old essays, and here it is, that tells the story of Yve-Alain's intellectual life as a series of deep and overlapping encounters with artists, critics, art historians, curators, editors, journal editors, and above all with works of art. In particular, the book has enriched my understanding of the early formation of the brilliant young scholar whose work on Malevich and Lissitzky first brought me to the United States in 1987. At that time, Yve-Alain was at Johns Hopkins, where his seminars drew graduate students from around the world and from all over the humanities, from art history, philosophy, all the literature departments, and the Humanities Center. This last having been one of the first and most important places in the world, the Anglophone world, for the reception of structuralist and post-structuralist thought. Hopkins was a hothouse. My debt to Yve-Alain is vast. In his 1990 book, Painting as Model, and the numerous collaborative publications and exhibitions that followed it, and there are many more than a list shown here, but I ran out of room. These publications have so fundamentally shaped my understanding of modernism that I simply cannot imagine the field without them. What would our study of modernism look like without Yve-Alain's signature theorization of abstraction's non-compositional strategies, of the aspiration to self-erasure that drove the work of certain modernists, of the deliberate anti-heroism or minor greatness, the pursuit of minor greatness by others? What would modernism look like without his articulation, in dialogue with Rosalind Krauss, of Cubism as an inquiry into the nature of signification? How would we understand Matisse without Yve-Alain's argument about the artist's decentering of vision or his discovery of the color-quantity-quality relation? Where would the study of the Russian avant-garde be without his theorization of the role of axonometry in Lissitzky's reconceptualization of suprematist space? And the list of questions goes on and on. But what each of these pioneering theorizations of modern art have in common, aside from their brilliance and imagination, is their foundation in the intellectual and sensory pleasure Yve-Alain takes in close looking, whether in the studio, the gallery, the classroom, or everyday life. In a 1982 tribute to his mentor, Roland Barthes, Yve-Alain writes that the first lesson was always that, quote, nothing that seems trivial is meaningless. To begin with, we have to look at things very closely, at the end of our nose, as materially as possible, because only this slight nearsightedness frees us at the outset from the myth of depth. The real flavor is found in the grain on the surface of things, unquote. In 2014, so that's 25 years after I finished coursework, I was reminded once again of the first lesson. We were together in a seminar on Cubism hosted by Harry Cooper at the National Gallery. After I presented a few still super inchoate thoughts on this little-known rubber-stamped still life drawing by Fernand Léger, Yve-Alain walked up to the projection screen to examine it more closely. That simple act was a literal, if unself-conscious, entirely unself-conscious performance of nearsightedness. It was a small moment, but nonetheless a kind of performative reminder, once again, of his lifelong attention to the materiality, to the grain of the object. Since Léger sparked that memory, I want to turn now to a later corpus of his drawings, dating mostly to 1933 and 1934, which seem themselves to model a certain kind of nearsightedness. This is just one of this corpus's 20 or so sheets. Although this group of drawings has been one of my minor obsessions for close to a decade, it was only 2 days ago that I discovered, in the course of preparing these brief remarks, that Yve-Alain had, of course, already touched upon them in his 2009 discussion of Ellsworth Kelly's alleged debt to Léger's colour planes. Although I can't get into that incredibly complicated argument here, I was relieved to find that mention because I'd been a bit worried that he might not want to look at this drawing here, which would have been awkward at a celebration in his honour. In any case, extracted from any context of compositional belonging, a single object is here centered on the sheet like a botanical specimen. Using a fine-nibbed pen and black ink, Léger first establishes a closed contour and then rapidly scratches and hatches and loops thin lines within that bounded shape in order to produce a dry and tightly wound drama of tonal modelling that renders the physical plenitude of a three-dimensional object, a fragment of a nut. Measuring around 41 by 33 centimetres, the cardstock support is large for pen drawing, the traditional dimensions of which tend to run small due to the micro size of the pen nibs. Seen alone in an extreme close-up, a nut fragment looms much, much larger than life, like any number of objects or parts thereof in the artist's early anti-narrative film Ballet Mécanique. The drawing, however, expands Léger's object world beyond that of the manufactured and industrial dynamism for which he's best known, to include now also the vegetal. This trio of sheets from the same corpus represents another excursion, in this case into the mineralogical realm and deep geological time. They depict nodules of flint, a form of quartz that occurs in layers and irregularly shaped lumps in chalk beds and limestones. But Léger drains them of the rainbow of coloured minerals that sediment in rocks over the course of millennia. Significantly, in fact, there is no colour whatsoever anywhere in this 1933 corpus, which surprises us, given Léger's renown as a lifelong colourist. In a letter to a friend of the time, he confided that, quote, "Colour disgusts me. It's too easy. Instead, I am immersed, absorbed, plunged into black and white. I am making highly finished drawings in the style of Dürer. Dense, severe, radiant, and edgy," unquote. Perhaps this rock-faced detail from one of the Northern artist's best-known engravings, which was exhibited in a Dürer show at the Petit Palais in Paris in 1933, can provide an example of what Léger might have had in mind. But what encouraged the modernist artist to look at Dürer in the first place and to take a plunge into black and white? What prompted him to abandon, if ultimately only temporarily, his lifelong immersion in colour? What accounts for the salience and persistence of contrast in these drawings, and for the sheer amount of black ink expended in their production? And finally, what accounts for his anomalous focus, as Yve-Alain puts it in his Léger-Kelly essay, on the single object, when all of his work up to this date had avoided precisely this? One possible answer might lie in Léger's encounter and subsequent friendship with his upstairs neighbour, the modernist designer and photographer Charlotte Perriand, seen here with a friend on the Normandy coast, raising aloft a bone fragment. In the mid-1930s, Perriand, Léger and other friends often spent Sundays wandering in parks and quarries and along beaches, looking for found objects to take back to their studios, particularly ones that had been reshaped over time through exposure to the elements. One of Perriand's most spectacular finds was this flint nodule, which she brought home, washed, and photographed on a neutral background using a rudimentary setup, a Rolleiflex and 2 ordinary desk lamps. If her camera deprived the flint of its scale, so too did Léger's pen, which renders all his singular objects scaleless and thus defamiliarized. Léger's plunge into black and white, arguably, had as much to do with a dialogue with Perrion's photographic inventory of found objects then, as with his love for Dürer's dense, severe, radiant, and edgy line. Let me close by simply noting that neither Léger nor Perrion seems to have been much interested in the long or landscape view. Instead, they both preferred the close-up, the near-sighted view, the grain and the surface. They had understood, in other words, the first lesson. Thank you.
Everyone, thanks for being here, and also I want to thank everyone at the gallery and Pam for bringing us together, which is one of her great talents, aside from being a genius. Yve-Alain is my favorite kind of intellectual. He's both opinionated and open-minded. That seems to be, at this point of extreme polarization, a kind of contradiction. But in fact, these two opposites are not in the least opposed to one another. I first met him some 40 years ago when my dear friend Elizabeth Sussman and I organized an exhibition called Endgame, Reference and Simulation in Recent Painting and Sculpture. And we invited Yve-Alain and other luminaries, some in this room, to contribute essays to an exhibition of contemporary painting, what's now called Neo Geo. Yve-Alain did not make a secret that the artists in the exhibition were not of great interest. However, that's the opinionated part. However, he was open-minded enough and inspired enough to have written a brilliant essay that remains relevant to this day, Painting the Task of Mourning. So in the spirit of thinking about ideas that migrate, which in some ways for me is the definition of a good idea, one that can move from one context to another productively, I want to make a quick reading of an essay that frankly I've read many times, Matisse and Archie drawing, and I think only perhaps recently begun to truly take in, which is another mark of someone who's really wonderful to engage with intellectually. I want to think about, in this drawing, how the question of value is elaborated by Yve-Alain in terms of color, which anyone who's ever tried to talk about color knows that it's almost impossible. It's an incredibly difficult subject to deal with. So in working through Matisse's own work, obviously, and also his testimony, his statements and writings, Yve-Alain calls upon what Maria just referred to as the quantity-quality issue within color. That 1 centimeter of blue, for instance, is very different. 1 square centimeter of blue is very different from 1 square meter, as Matisse put it. Yve-Alain, surprisingly and brilliantly, elaborates this issue of scale as color, scale as a value relationship within color in drawing or a woodcut in a monochrome object as opposed to a color one, making the point that, for instance, oh sorry, it's so small, but that the area of the flesh, for instance, takes on a different kind of color, as it were, than the areas that are more tightly marked. But then a second operation occurs in the so-called Matisse system, and that is the color is transposed once it's added to the canvas. So it's one thing to have a value, a kind of economy of value with the color in a black and white image, which is completely about scale. But then when color enters the picture, the issue is more the internal relations between color, and this is called color transposition. So on the one hand, this economy of color has to do with scale, and on the other, with transposition. Oh, sorry. I hope you could all hear that. So I want to take this insight, and by the way, I don't know if you remember this, Yve-Alain, but you showed me a slide from Matisse in my orals, and I said, I just have nothing to say about it. Which was really a rather cheeky thing for me to say to you. we had a past, so I thought it was okay. But now that arrogant younger person seems like an idiot to me. But anyway, the question that I've been working on in my work in recent years is, what is the value of an image? In other words, what kind of, how does an image, a quantum of information that is visual, change its value due to the kinds of circulation that we have in the world today, from the internet to television, et cetera, et cetera. And I've been trying to think about this with regard to something that Louise Waller's been doing now for some time, which is adjusting her photos to scale. This is called Adjusted to Fit. This is her work from the recent Venice Biennale. Some of you may have seen it, where she takes an earlier photograph and makes it fill the entire room. In other words, an image expands to the scale, the architecture scale of its limits. An image can expand to the degree to which it is stopped. It's adjusted to fit. And here's an exhibition of Louise Waller's work, more recently. I think it was her last or penultimate exhibition at Metro Pictures, which, as you probably know, recently closed, where there was an adjusted to fit image on the one hand. In other words, the image expanded to scale, but also one of her tracings, which is done by an illustrator. She commissioned someone to make tracings from her photographs. So in a way, I realized that adjusted to fit in terms of a scalar relationship and traced in terms of a transposition was really, in some ways, partaking of the Matisse system, except changing scale to a kind of contemporary idea of how images expand to the limit that we allow them to, and they are transposed from one format to another, from photograph to drawing. I think I didn't mention that this is one of Louise Waller's most well-known early photographs of a Turin and a Pollock painting. So this is a photograph that's been traced. It's interesting to me that maybe by coincidence or maybe not, the transposition, the tracing, brings us back to the force of drawing, just as Yve-Alain had understood drawing as a way into Matisse's system initially. Yve-Alain's account of the Matisse system, like so much of his thinking, has helped me to understand things that I think he's had little interest in, actually. He's helped me to understand the contemporary economy of images as something continuous with the great works of Matisse that have taken me, personally, decades to really, truly see. That is one of the reasons that, for me, he's so valuable.
Hi everyone, thank you for organizing this, and thank you to the gallery as well. Thank you, Yve-Alain, for bearing with us through this. I'm going to say a few things about pseudomorphosis, which is a kind of key term and method for Yve-Alain, although it is one that he really is not that well known. It's not as well known, I would think, as a lot of his other thinking and writing, even though it's latent in a lot of his published work. And maybe it's rivaled only from me in terms of its importance to Yve-Alain's writings about non-composition. So not much is published. For a long time, at least as far as I know, the most important essay in this, to this end about pseudomorphosis was an essay that he originally gave as a talk at International Congress of Art History proceeding in 1992, defending the wit against kind of charges of plagiarism of Morelet. And because it was given at this conference proceeding, this essay existed, I think it still only exists, in this completely obscure conference proceeding, which I had access to only in the form of galleys that Yve-Alain at some point graciously gave me because I could never find these darn proceedings. So this has been handed on to many of my students in seminars with the scribbles and the page numbers and everything in it. And he finishes that essay with a little bit of an explanation of pseudomorphosis and its importance. He says that, and by the way, this was also my first encounter with Yve-Alain. I was at this congress in 1992 as a green graduate student. I had no idea who Yve-Alain was. I could not follow his talk at all. I had just spent about a year in the US at that point. I couldn't understand, I didn't understand that much English, and certainly not his English. I've gotten better at it. At any rate, so this is what he said. We have to keep slicing hair and distinguishing between things. Now, I still don't know whether slicing hair is actually an idiom in English, because I mess up English idioms all the time too. I think you mean maybe splitting hairs, but that doesn't quite fit here. But we have to keep slicing hair and distinguishing between things that look the same in order to undo the anti-historic labor done by all those fighting for an essentialist position. If such a task is as to be labeled formalist, I claim that label without any kind of shame, end quote. Now, fast forward 2015, Yve-Alain published on the uses and abuses of lookalikes in October, a little bit more accessible venue, in fall 2015. And there went to what was the inspiration for his use of the term, as I understand it, in Erwin Panofsky's work, which of course is very fitting given this event in this context, because as someone had already mentioned, Panofsky preceded Yve-Alain at the IAS some decades. So Panofsky, Yve-Alain quotes Panofsky in this essay, or summarizes it as follows, on pseudomorphosis. The emergence of a form A, morphologically analogous to or even identical with a form B, yet entirely unrelated to it from a genetic point of view. He then goes on to draw comparisons to Levi-Strauss's arguments against migrations of motifs across non-Western and Western cultures being so appropriate. And then goes into his earlier observations about Morelet and Le Wit in his defense of Le Wit. Now, I want to say a few things about how important pseudomorphosis, I realize looking back, kind of has been on my encounters with Yve-Alain, my days as a student with Yve-Alain, and then say a few things about an exhibition that has a lot to do with this concept. These are not actually truly pseudomorphosis examples, because some of these actually have genetic relationships, but they have a lot to do with lookalikes, which is a very, very important theme, much more broadly speaking, I think, in Yve-Alain's work. Okay, so I actually applied to Harvard as a graduate student with an essay on the role of Aaron Siskin's photography in relationship to abstract expressionism, and kind of tried to untangle why maybe they have something to do with abstract expressionist painting or not. It's kind of a miracle to me that I got in with this essay. I still don't know how much Yve-Alain thinks of all of this was pseudo or not. And then the list goes on. My first seminar paper in a seminar on Mondrian, which I will confess here, I originally didn't want to take because while I am a huge, and I think mostly my aesthetic sensibilities align kind of scarily with Yve-Alain's, I did not get Mondrian at all. And I did not know how I was going to suffer through what I thought would be a whole seminar on Mondrian. And so, you know, wanting to work on minimalism and abstract painting post-war, I suggest, so Yve-Alain would give, at least at that time, lists of seminar topics that we could pick from. None of the topics interested me. So I proposed to write on Mondrian and minimalism and Newman. And Yve-Alain said, well, I can already completely predict what you're going to say right now. This is what you're going to say, but if this is what you want to do, go ahead. He was right. I didn't understand he was right until I was done with the paper. Speaking of pseudo. Next, oral exams, which I want to just say were terrifying, I think, for all of us. Some of us had the pleasure of doing these with slides. Some of us had to do these with original objects in the Fog Museum. I got a Abreu that looked like some mixture of Gough and Seurat. And the best I could do is, I said, this kind of looks like some post-impressionist wannabe, which happened to be kind of right, thankfully. Some of us in this room had a comparison between Barnett Newman and Rosa Nova and didn't do so well in that from what I heard. I will leave that person unidentified. Was it me? I didn't identify you, you just outed yourself. I mean, this is really scary stuff. So then I did my first exhibition on Volz's photography, trying to disentangle Volz's photographs. Many of them looked like his paintings, from his paintings, so more lookalikes. And then, of course, I wrote my dissertation on Oblique Autobiography and also kind of trying to disentangle these very different contexts. And that is probably a little bit of a pseudomorphosis case from the context of American colorful painting. Anyway, so there's a way in which the pseudomorphosis concept actually kind of comes across as a little bit as kind of like, oh, these things are wrong. But as I was recently reading this essay in the context of this exhibition on monochrome art that I have co-curated at the Smart Museum at the University of Chicago, I began to realize that actually there's a lot of kind of positivity in that concept, and even in Yve-Alain's essay. And I guess I wanted to say a few things about that. This essay is called On the Uses and Abuses, and that uses is actually really important. And so this is one of the things Yve-Alain has to say about the uses rather than the abuses of pseudomorphosis. What lesson do I draw from this? Essentially, that pseudomorphosis is not necessarily entirely pseudo, but that one has to watch out in order to avoid falling into a trap. If two objects look the same, it does not mean that they have much in common, much less that they have the same meaning. And then he actually goes on to me, a very, very moving sentence about the kind of pedagogical and hermeneutic function and use of pseudomorphosis. And I think that gets at how much many of us, certainly me, have learned from Yve-Alain's practice of pseudomorphosis and laying out of pseudomorphosis incidents. He says, the capacity of perceiving resemblances, analogies, similarities is at the heart, at the aesthetic heart, one could even say, of human knowledge. It's a big statement, and I think it's really, really right. So perceiving similarities produces knowledge, and can produce knowledge. So I want to just briefly show you a few installation shots, I suppose, from this exhibition on monochrome multitudes, which I co-curated with my partner in crime, Oriana Cachon, at the Smart Museum. Which I want to say really from the get-go, as I started working on this exhibition, I have thought for my part very much as a kind of homage to Yve-Alain, as much as this exhibition is actually full of pseudomorphosis. In fact, when I early on mentioned it to Yve-Alain and mentioned that I was going to include some examples I was going to include, somehow Ed Reinhardt came up. he immediately, of course, claimed that Ed Reinhardt had no interest in monochromes, as black paintings weren't monochromes, and I completely understand why Yve-Alain is saying that, but Reinhardt was in the monochrome exhibition anyway, for many other good reasons. Okay, so you see here a view into the Yellow Room in the opening. Basically, this exhibition is about, includes 127 works, and it's structured around monochrome rooms, so yellow, blue, red, etc., and thematic rooms, and it basically is structured around these rooms that are pseudomorphotic, where things that are very, very similar, so lots of yellow monochromes, lots of black monochromes, reveal themselves, I hope, instantly to be very different from one another through the virtue of this juxtaposition in the same space. Multitudes gets at the kind of cultural meanings of color of the monochrome and vernacular meanings, gender, race. We were seeking to be geographically expansive, so we have Asian works, Latin American works, European, North America, of course, and also expansive in terms of materials and media. So we have digital work, film, performance pieces, music, sound, objects made from concrete, pantyhose, cinnamon, you name it. And just sort of to give you a couple of examples, the Yellow Room very much, so just with the Amanda Williams, color theory, Andrew Truitt, William Turnbull, Sheila Hicks, Lyman Kipp, and an Ames chair, and then the Boko Delaney that is not in view. Getting at completely different ways in which artists, in this case, used yellow towards engaging with questions around redlining and gentrification, kind of responses to minimalism on a much smaller scale with industrial materials through craft and wool, confluences of painting and sculpture, etc. The White Room very much juxtaposing a more kind of essentializing version of engagements with White and Robert Ryman's work, of course incredibly important in Yve-Alain's work. I teach that Ryman essay about every other year at least. To engagements with White through race, or in the context of race, in the Bethany Collins work, a pattern of practice, and then there's a Günther Oecker and a Tony Tessett and many other things. This is a really kind of maybe pseudomorphosis juxtaposition in a black room, which is the Ad Reinhardt that Yve-Alain would not put in a monochrome show. And Theaster Gates' tar painting, which for me very much, I wanted to try and bring together these very seemingly opposed types of art making. Reinhardt understood as such a kind of autonomous modernist artist, so removed this art seemingly from our social and political concerns, or his. And Theaster's work, which is so overdetermined in terms of race. And yet, Theaster is also, I know, as a colleague, very much engaged in a history of modernism, just as Reinhardt was very much engaged in the anti-Vietnam protest, etc. So trying to bring things a little bit more closer together was important. Okay, so I'm going to skip all of these, hopefully trigger your interest, and close with one of the two commissions that we did. This one is by Hego Young in the lobby. And Hego actually took up, in some sense, without using this term, this question of pseudomorphosis. So the wall she specified was to be a pseudo-Yves Klein blue. So we got the pseudo going here. And for Hego, that's very much a way of engaging with something in a way that is not completely genuine, but still somehow matters and is important. So there's a kind of value in the pseudo for Hego, as I would say, there is in Yve-Alain's work and thinking. And then she called the entire mini exhibition in this lobby quasi-legit. And I guess that's a good place to close, because I think that in terms of Hego's engagement with Solowit here and with Yves Klein, she's engaging with a tradition that weighs heavily on her and that she's working through. And I think that to be quasi-legit is probably the best we can all do, certainly if I want to speak for myself, with respect to Yve-Alain sitting right there. Thank you. get too excited. I'm so honored to be here, and huge thanks to everyone and to Pam for organizing this so brilliantly, and obviously to Yve-Alain for being the reason that we're all here. I'm not sure I even deserve to be here, but I have 3 distinctions that I guess I would make. One is that I think I'm the one grandkid, so to speak, on this panel today, because I was lucky enough to have Pam Lee as my undergraduate advisor first before I went on to study with Yve-Alain. And I guess I'll get to the second and third distinctions a bit later, but I wanted to keep this a bit personal, and I was inspired by a few years ago, before the pandemic, I went to a conversation that Yve-Alain actually had about Morale with Benjamin Buchloh, and I wrote him a note afterwards saying, oh, it was so great, and Yve-Alain said, yes, it was light. And then he said, oh, and that other text I sent you, that was light too. Maybe I should write a manifesto in defense of lightness. And I always have been thinking through that in the years since. My first experience actually of lightness was really through Yve-Alain's voice, and we've talked a bit about his voice today. First I was applying to graduate school, and I got home to my little apartment in New York one day, and there's a physical answering machine, so I pressed play, and there was a voicemail from Yve-Alain Bois, and he said, hello, Michelle, it's Yve-Alain Bois. Sorry, and then he chuckled, and then he proceeded to say, I'm so happy to tell you got into graduate school. So first of all, it was amazing to me, like somehow in this moment of incredible seriousness, where normally you would be getting some sort of form letter, I got this wonderful voicemail, and with this chuckle, like this characteristic joy and insouciance and lightness, and that was really something that connected me in. Then I asked Pam, what should I do, where should I go to graduate school, and Pam said, well, there's no option, you have to go study with Yve-Alain Bois, and one lesson is that if Pam Lee tells you to do something, you should definitely do it. So I went to study with Yve-Alain, and I think that, again, that kind of lightness is something that has allowed Yve-Alain, in combination, and I don't know anyone else who has this combination, of that light touch with the most incredible intellectual heft, gravitas, and wellspring of knowledge that he has given the world. That combination is incredible, and it's a testament to the way that his effect has radiated throughout so many generations, obviously, and fields and communities. So I got to graduate school, and among many other topics that Yve-Alain introduced us to, from his work on Barnett Newman, he was doing at the time, to work with conservators and researching new materials and methods of modern art. I wanted to just give you a typical, or maybe a snapshot of a day, what a day might be like with studying with Yve-Alain Bois. Well, in the morning, I got an email and said, Donald Rumsfeld is coming to speak at a square in Boston, and we should go protest it. So I went with Yve-Alain and Paul Galvez on the T to this square in Boston, and we didn't see Donald Rumsfeld, but we stood around and we made our voice known. Then we got back on the T, and this is probably 2003, and then they said, oh, there's this funny new television show that just has aired on this network called Bravo, and it's called Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. Should we watch it? So I thought, okay, so come over later. So I went over later to Yve-Alain's apartment on Norfolk Street, which many have been to, Norfolk Court, and we sat there and we watched this highly problematic show about a makeover of a straight man. And then afterward, we had dinner, and then the most amazing thing happened, which was that Yve-Alain brought out this incredible work on paper by Lygia Clark, and it was, of course, one of her interactive pieces, and we sat there, and I had never seen a work of Lygia Clark's in the flesh before. And then we talked about Martin Barret and many other artists that I had never heard of. And so that was just a kind of arc of a day with Yve-Alain Bois. I learned even more when I actually taught for Yve-Alain. And the course I happened to be the head teaching fellow was B16, Abstraction in the 20th Century,
a legendary class which covered, among many other things, the principles of non-composition, icon index and symbol, Seurat's digitization of the mark, and we were supposed to translate all of this to about 350 non-art history majors who were just taking the class to satisfy a humanities requirement. So we were doing this, and I have to say, just to make a long story very, very short, that in the spirit of this intergenerational gathering, Christine Mehring, among many others, was the head TF of this legendary course before me, and others were as well. And Christine and Yve-Alain, it was a testament to this kind of palimpsest of layers of students who had taught this course and transmuted these precepts to many, many econ majors and future politicians and lawyers of the world, some of whom still thought that they recognized a camel in the Jackson Pollock. But it was a labor of love, I really will say. And this is my physical prop, which is that I have actually the binder that Christine Mehring made many years before I taught the class, that was handed down from head TF to head TF. For B16, I'm the last repository of this binder, and I wanted to present it to you today, Yve-Alain. The fact is, I still, the card is here, but I'll give it to you later. So you can see it says in faded marker B16. Please, course material. So this is for you. In defense of lightness, it's a real tome. And then I would just say, though, that also Yve-Alain was also the only person who I think would comment line by line on the most minute details of a text, for example, a dissertation or a paper, even on the footnotes. And I'll never forget, in one of his many, literally line by line comments on my dissertation, he said, oh, this person appears like un cheveu sur la soupe, like a hair in the soup. So not splicing hairs, but a hair on the soup. And that also was stuck with me, because I thought, well, it was so interesting, and his point was really that this shouldn't be here, but at the same time, his entire practice, as we've heard, is about looking at the hair in the soup, that nothing that seems trivial is meaningless, as Maria quoted Yve-Alain quoting. And that also, I think that this kind of lightness, this almost aesthetic of distraction, which of course relates to your reading of Matisse's Blinding, for example, is, quote, a mode of aesthetics that no longer tries to reassure the subject with an illusion of mastery, but on the contrary, plays with a loss of mastery in order to force the subject to explore the pre-semiotic sensuality of a certain opacity of things. So that was another lesson that really stuck with me. I think the other thing about community was really resonant when a few years later I actually left graduate school and went to take a job at Art Forum magazine, which my illustrious former classmate and predecessor, Scott Rothkopf, had sort of led me there, and Yve-Alain was a contributing editor to the publication. I felt nervous about leaving academia. I always thought I would become a professor, but I left this program somewhat prematurely to become an editor and a writer, and at the same time, Yve-Alain fully supported that move. Now, first of all, he had just actually left Harvard to go to the Institute, but he was fully supportive, and I think he was obviously very committed to the question of criticism and to art criticism, again, championing a kind of apprehension of art that was always against mastery, against myths of biography and hagiography and beauty, and against the types of subversion that were only symbolic. He contributed amazing texts and insights to the magazine, obviously both before and while I was there. There were pieces that were on Martin Barré's works, specifically, for example, that really allowed an insight into this artist that had not been widely known before. But also there's a text that's in this amazing Oblique Autobiography about the massacre at Charlie Hebdo and the kind of personal history that Yve-Alain had with that publication. And so with that kind of specificity, he really always reminded me that he never does what's easy, he never just gives an empty gesture. That led to, years later, a difficult moment, which was that I actually I resigned from my position at Art Forum in protest. To make a long story short, Yve-Alain was one of the first people I told that I was going to do this, and he and the other contributing editors wrote a letter, in support of me and the staff. And he really stuck his neck out for me when he did not have to. It was one of the most difficult periods in my life, and Yve-Alain was there. And I actually only learned how much of a role he played in that later, actually from James Meyer. Yve-Alain didn't trumpet this at all, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank you in person for that depth of support and for ballast. I've never really gotten a chance to do that. So, well, I had just quit my job and I wasn't sure what to do next, but I knew I had to finish my dissertation. After all these years, I didn't want to join the long line of illustrious students who had not finished their PhD. And I will say these are my potentially second and third distinctions. I think I am the last student to conclude a dissertation under your mentorship. Thank you. And I think, unfortunately, I have the dubious distinction of taking the longest time from start to finish of any student by far of yours. I ended up going to the Museum of Modern Art, which I was extremely excited about, and of course Yve-Alain was really supportive. And I think one thing about Yve-Alain is that, of course, just because he was supportive of me personally, doesn't mean he is supportive of everything. He is extremely, clear-eyed about his opinions. And just to remind you that this is what he had written in 2005 about my new place of work, sort of fast-forwarding and flashing back, about the rehang at MoMA in 2005. He says, quote, "Schadenfreude is not my thing." He had heard a lot of criticisms from his friends, and he said, "I was in no rush to inspect the disaster, especially after months of robotic praise from the New York Times. But after I finally paid the new MoMA an extended visit, I was left wondering, what's all the fuss about? Why did I feel so numb, so devoid of passion, that I couldn't even muster any anger?" Well, fast forward, and he has been, I think he's changed his opinion of certain aspects of the hang. I know that for a fact. He's been incredibly supportive, incredibly wonderful interlocutor to many of us, many colleagues at the museum. And then it was so gratifying just to read in the Oblique Autobiography the newly translated essay, Why Do Exhibitions? And he says, quote, "The direct contact I was able to have with the works, allowing me to experience the immense joy brought about by this unforeseen comparison. This is the real reason, I believe, why art historians like to organize exhibitions so much, and it is why, despite all of the concomitant trials and tribulations, I shall continue to do so," end quote. So I just wanted to close by going back to this idea of lightness, which for Yve-Alain I think should not be mistaken for indifference. And another quote from him in this Oblique Autobiography is, quote, "Indifference is always, first and foremost, reactionary, whether one knows it or not, and can serve to justify the most reprehensible actions in addition to the worst kind of art." End quote. Indifference is leaden, courage is lightness. Lightness skips like a stone from non-composition to chance to impasto to axiometric projection to truth to fraudulence to immanence and to formlessness. One last note he wrote on one of my footnotes was, quote, I was writing about Warhol's Silver Clouds, and he asked, "Is buoyancy a formal attribute?" I said that it was, I guess, and it made me think, well, okay, buoyancy is maybe more of an ability or an event. It's a little bit like the smoke from a pipe wafting in the air and around until it kind of suffuses you. And I realized that I think buoyancy is a moral attribute. And I thank Yve-Alain for his buoyancy and his ballast.
One more. I have the honor to read for Harry Cooper, who wants to thank Maria for a conversation they had about this event just last week, yes? Last weekend. Following a bit on what Michelle said, appropriately, the title of his homage is Yve-Alain's Accent. When I stepped into your Hopkins summer school extension course on the Russian avant-garde in 1989, at the age of 30, I had no idea that it would be the start of a lifelong intellectual journey. Who knew there were 3 different kinds of Ostrani? What the hell were they? I still have my notes. I should really look it up. But what mattered is that I had found someone who spoke my aesthetic language and spoke it in a dialect so different from mine as to ensure a bracing defamiliarization around every corner. When I was head TA for your modern art course at Harvard, the fabulous a big part of the job was translating the lectures from your accent into something the students could understand. One day they were all stumped by the fact that you had spent a whole class discussing cows. And unfortunately, it was a lecture I had missed. I repeated the word out loud, trying to reconstitute your approach to English, stretching the word out as if on a torture rack. Cows. Cows. And then I had it. Chaos. Suddenly the whole lecture made sense. Everyone cheered. The and form took form. And then there was something called neoplasticism, a language in which everything mattered, everything had to be observed, and yet at the same time, one had to cling to the broad view, avoiding the fray of mere details, the trap of particulars. Forest and trees at once. You showed me the way, and it keeps on going as a method of thinking about anything and everything, not just Mondrian. But now I'm getting sentimental over you. It's a great song. So I will end the way we end every phone call, in a language neither of us really understands. Ciao.
Thank you.
it's just really wonderful to see everybody here. And I'm just going to pass the mic to you briefly before we do a little bit of an informal conversation. We promise it won't be like our orals.
Well, I'm a little overwhelmed, I guess. So I don't know exactly how to go on. I like the chaos story. But I think Harry is mixing two universities. He was at Hopkins.
It was definitely a Hopkins.
Yeah.
Continue.
No, but I haven't made a joke about it. It's different. I made a whole lecture about cows in modern art. So yeah, I'm a little overwhelmed. So I think it's better if you start talking. I want to make one correction to I think it was what James said. The texts are not in any random order. They are republished in a reversed order to the original appearance. So the first text in the book is the last published text, and the last text in the book is the first published. It goes that so it goes, and that's. And I thought I realized maybe I should have said so. Maybe I should have explained in the introduction that I would do, but I didn't think about explaining because for me it was natural. It was just a natural way to go. You just climb back, and you realize, oh, I wrote that. I completely forgot.
But that was a case of misprision, because that's not what I said. I said that the different yous, the different moments of Yve-Alain emerge in different places. That it's not a kind of, you're 17 at the start and you're whatever we are now at the end.
Today's very fine. So.
Well, we hope there'll be some space to accommodate questions from the audience. I imagine there are many. But maybe, given that this is a kind of hybrid event between retirement party, book launch, festschriftisch celebration, maybe, since many of us were just talking about your mentorship, could you say a little bit about teaching, pedagogy? Not that you ever claim to have I guess not.
Well, no, I don't know if I have much to say about pedagogy, but I don't like giving lectures, and so I don't like teaching undergraduate students. I never liked it. I had to do it, but I never liked it. But I always liked the seminar, and always try to have the students work on something they want to work on, which is why I was trying. What Christine said. I don't really have a view of pedagogy, except that I have an example, which was one of Barthes. Not that I want to compare myself to Barthes, but this is the example I have of pedagogy. I have two examples, which are both discussed in the book, actually. One in the text of Barthes seminar, the other one in the text of Dami's seminar, and they're totally, almost incompatible models, and I tried to be more Barthesian and Damitian in that thing, but maybe I didn't succeed. Barthes' idea of teaching was not about transmitting knowledge. So that you can go to Wikipedia. You say Wikipedia, because it didn't exist at the time, but basically it's what it meant. You can go to a library, you can go and read encyclopedia, whatever. Just knowledge is not my cup of tea. What he said is, I'm going to show you, by doing it, how one writes, what it is to be a writer. And so his entire seminar, year after year, I only attended 3 years and a half, I think, was bringing material in order to prepare a book. And so we would discuss a text that he thought might be useful for that particular book he was going to write. And I remember particularly when in particular was for the Fragment du discours amoureux, made us read week after week after week 2 texts by Freud. One became famous later because of a text by other writers called Charles Beaton, but then one was completely unknown at the time and is still not very well known today. It's called A Case of Paranoia that Disproves Psychological Theory or something like that. And we read that text ever and ever, line by line, and at the end, about 2 months into that, Bart said, okay, fine, we're done with that, it's not useful. So there was this, I remember very well, one student was Brazilian called Milton, huge mouth, he just said, oh Roland, tu peux pas nous faire ça! Fly over. So that was, so this is something that he basically said, while writing is in part to accumulate a lot of stuff that you can put in the trash. And to have the courage to put it in the trash. And I would say, that was a great, so I don't know if I did that exactly in seminar, but that's one thing. The other model was the model of Danish, which was to overpower you with so many avenues to explore that it was, it was on the verge. You had to be resistant not to go to all avenues because you wouldn't be able to advance yourself at all. So there was a model that had, one of them I hope I follow. I'm not sure. Converse.
That's how you stop.
That's exactly
Yes. Can I just say, you would walk into seminar with a big pot of soup and say, I'm eating, you talk.
No, it was, I talked last week.
Your turn.
Abreu, should I know, or shall we open it to the audience?
You talk.
Well, there are a lot of your students here, so why don't they jump in? Anybody?
All right, why don't we take some questions or comments from the audience then? I'm imagining that you are perhaps less timid or maybe tired than we are up here. Questions, please. Comments?
Yes. Hi. Hello. Just to kind of break the ice here and raise my hand. It's such an interesting story. Yve-Alain and I are working together on the Ellsworth Kelly catalog, isn't it? We're on volume 3 right now, which is pretty good. Just how you met Ellsworth, the very first.
It's actually mentioned in the book in one of the little introduction to the essays, and I had tried to meet Ellsworth when I came to America as an exchange student after high school. So I was in a farmer's high school in America, Hanover, Pennsylvania. Anyway, I written to Ellsworth and tried to meet him, but it was never made. I was in a family. It was a very heavily, guarded Christian organization, and so they thought that going to New York was absolutely not possible. So I did manage twice, but it was difficult. And I tried to meet Ellsworth. I'd written to him, and it didn't happen. He didn't understand that I was so limited in my capacity to escape to Babylon, and so he didn't meet. But I was very impressed by his work very early on as a teenager, and I remember being a little distressed when I found out that he was not really an abstract artist, or at least that's the way I understood it. And I thought he had betrayed, so I lost his. I stopped looking at what he was doing, and then much later when I was at Hopkins, there was this great show, his work on paper, that came to the Baltimore Museum of Art. And I was, again, completely fascinated. And wanted to connect with it, not yet. And then I got an invitation by the National Gallery and the Jeu de Paume in Paris to write a catalogue for the show that at the time it was in 91, 92. And that's the time I found it in 90. The first time we met was at the opening. I had already been asked to participate in that catalogue, but about a year in advance. Before that, I met him at the opening of the Humanities show at the National Gallery. And it was a dinner, a typical institution dinner, round table, 2 rich collectors, 2 less rich collectors, 1 curator, 1 artist. And Eldridge and I were talking. And it was one young collector offended that we were talking instead of talking to our neighbors. And I told all of these neighbors on both sides, oh, come on, I have to do likewise, that's why I'm here. She has an angle, so she's here. They want us. This is not interesting to hear an artist speak, so that's the way we became friends after that. That was the first time, fairly late, because I'd known about his work and loved it since I was like 15, so it's fairly late.
What about the postcard? Yes, I just wanted to comment on our wonderful collaboration. I wanted to comment on our extraordinary collaboration on the Forum exhibition, and I remember very, very vividly that I was in Paris working on an essay for the Primitivism and 20th Century Art catalog on Giacometti. And I had these ideas that kind of went against the grain of the normal reading of Giacometti, and you told me I should read Denis Olier's book, Prise de la Concorde, and that's how I came up with sort of, what my breakthrough on Giacometti. And then that's what I think came up, that was our breakthrough.
Absolutely.
For the Forum exhibition.
Absolutely. So, I did have a long range.
Informe hors chaos.
That's a French word.
So I have maybe a question you can't answer because you couldn't answer it when I first asked you. When you were at Johns Hopkins, I received a bundle of papers that I had to read for a particular reason, which we won't go into right now. But they were around the question of ideas model and axonometry, right? And so I remember asking you before email, so I think I called you, and I said, so I'm an architect, right? And what's the problem with axonometry? You just make an axonometric and it's in true scale. What's the problem? And you said, I'm not quite sure yet. About a year or two ago, you announced that you were going to do a series of lectures on axonometry at the National Gallery, which you haven't yet delivered. So I'll ask you again, what's the problem with axonometry?
Well, I've still not found yet, otherwise I'll find it by writing the lectures, but that is postponed for the time being. Don't. Well, it has been repeatedly postponed, it is true. This is, I have to have I just have to have the right frame of mind to do this thing, because it involves a lot of different knowledge, but even in fields that I don't know much about. I have to be in the mood for learning. Yeah, you're right. And if that was also something that I inherited from Barth actually. That if you know too much in advance about something, then it's not going to be of any interest. Barth used to do his model of pedagogy also has to do with which is in principle the principle of l'école des études, but not many people apply. You're not supposed to speak about anything you are not researching at the moment. And it's a very, very difficult timing thing, because if you work already a little too much on a topic, and you are too much in advance of the students, it's not going to work. You're going to fail. If you have not worked at all, of course you're going to fail too. So it's a very complex balance, and Bart managed every single year to make a fantastic seminar just because he had nailed the exact dosage of work in advance and all that. So that's so basically, I'll not be able to respond to your question once I'm in the thick of it. Yeah.
But I took your axonometry. So
there was a first.
There.
I'm sure there'll be another one.
I see Hal.
Yve-Alain, may I ask you a personal question in public? Can you explain to us how you were so precocious? As a very young person, you had an extraordinary encounter with Richard Clark. You were onto Mondrian as a kid. I'm sure it's in here somewhere.
I was precocious, I cannot deny, but I don't know how. There was no interest in the visual arts in my family. Music, yes. No.
But there had to be a scene. Do tell.
No, I mean, I do mention my first visit to the Museum of Modern Art as something quite striking. The date itself isn't sure. My mother claimed I was 5, which is not possible. But it was before the age of 10. But it was, and that is the first visit that I remembered all my life. So obviously,
kids should be brought to museums very young. And not only do I remember all my life, but I also remember extremely well one particular work of art which I had never seen again. And I know exactly the way it looks. So that was the first visit that was very good. So maybe that's just pure luck. It was just, it's like Obelix was bumping to a cauldron of magic potion when he was a baby. It was an awful work by Saint-Gier for Manessi, one of the key, called Bethlehem or something. Anyway, it has to do with Christmas and Christianity. But I remember the work very well. And in fact, I needed to have a reproduction. In the end, it was not. And I described it to Isabelle Molefontaine, which was, and she knew exactly what it was. But it had never been shown again. It was Johnny. I never showed it. But and there were other works I remember too. The Large Rio Belle, which I was able to see again 30 years later at the show at the Pompidou and recognized this. I mean, that was his first visit, was very good. So if you have kids, bring them to museum early. Because
question that I wanted to ask as our esteemed colleagues were speaking and talking about different modalities of thought that have become so fundamental to the way that we talk about modernism, non-composition, minor anti-monumental strategies. That the thing that perhaps had been most formative for me was the idea of an artwork as a model. And its very basic notion that each of your engagements is so enduring. It's a kind of endurance sport, the way that you engage with each of these thought propositions. So I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, how did you come to that recognition or that way of thinking about an artwork as a thought proposition, as a model?
I mean, it's hard to know exactly, but I think that, things you read early on have more impact, of course. And the first book of aesthetic theory or whatever that I read before Bart, and I think I went through Bart because of that book, was Umberto Eco's the open work, which was published in France in '65 as the L'Œuvre Ouverte, published way before it was published in America. were very wide range of interest, including international situationists, which is really for the Protestant minister, it's kind of strange, but it was. He was a friend of Ricoeur, of Paul Ricoeur. So when I didn't know what to do after high school. I was 17, I really didn't know what to do. My father said, why don't you go and see my friend Paul? I'll help you figure out. So I went to see the friend Paul, and we were speaking about art and all that. And I remember specific things about this visit, including one which I can tell after, which is interesting. But one of the books he suggested me to read was La Rouverte. But very good. The other thing I remember about that visit is that because I was an apprentice artist. It was ridiculously, it was absurd. There was a teenage abstract painter. It was geometric abstract painter. Just the whole thing was grotesque. And I was offered an exhibition in the gallery, which was a pretty interesting place. It was not a commercial gallery. It was more interesting. It was an artist space called Studio Mehring, and it had been a gallery, I think, in the 50s or something, but it was basically, Mehring was a photographer, a fashion photographer of the 30s, very close, I think, friend of Vos. And anyway, he was having this artist space, and a lot of artists whom I respected had shown there. I think it was through Ligia, I can't remember exactly the detail, so I was there, offered a show. I felt I knew it was ridiculous, but I was like, I didn't know really what to do. And going to America in a farm for a year was, I think, a pretty good idea. But before that, I went to see Ricoeur, and I remember at the end of our conversation, at the end of that afternoon, like that, it was in a villa, in a small house in the suburbs of Paris, I don't remember where. I asked him something about art, and I remember asking him one specific question: how do you define a masterpiece? And he was like, bizarre, and I still remember his answer. The answer was, more or less, I can't remember the words exactly, but it's the one that can sustain the most possible different interpretation over time. So, wow, okay. And that's why I know that, I was not going to be an artist.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions or comments. Anyone?
I had a question about pseudomorphosis, but now I think maybe the same question asked about models would be even more interesting. So I'm wondering whether this property is more in the object or if it's in the viewer of the object, and if it's the latter, then how much this anthropomorphic nature of that interface, how that kind of caters to subjective interpretation, and what that would mean in both for the pseudomorphosis and for the model.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but if the quality, because pseudomorphosis is basically, an activity of, associating two things that have basically nothing in common except the way they look. This is, in a way, of course, the way you look at things that look alike could probably differ from one looker to the other, but nevertheless, there's the qualities of the object per se, which exist per se. So I don't know. I don't see how you have two points of the question.
I guess I'm curious whether the actual similarity was more important for it, or
the perceived, a real or perceived. Well, I guess it's a bit of the chicken and the egg question. Where did that start? I don't know if it's a similarity in intrinsic or extrinsic similarity. I don't don't know if it makes a huge difference for the topic. So, I don't know a better answer than that.
And in case of a model, is the model also the thing that is perceived, or is the thing that is in the...
It can be something that is in the mind, also in the intention of the artist. For Mondrian thought that he's painting to a model of philosophical concepts or even of civilization. So he thought of his work as a model, literally. But you could say that you have remarks on musical compositions. That sometimes you read some statement by Weber, and wow, he really had a lot of ideas about what this music represented, what it was a model for. So the idea of the work of art as a kind of epistemological model, which was Umberto Eco's concept, epistemological model in the work of art. I think it goes in that way. I mean, I don't think it's particularly peculiar to me, but
Okay, shall we all stand up and hoist an invisible glass to